This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Great to be here again. Talk number 3 on an introduction to some discourses from the Pali Canon. So, in case you haven't been able to get to the last 2 weeks, the idea of this series is to introduce you to the body of discourses that go back to the Buddha, that are preserved in the Pali Canon, which is to say the collection of ancient Buddhist compositions in the Pali language. So when you hear this phrase Pali Canon, it means the early Buddhist compositions in the Pali language. The only complete surviving collection of early Buddhist texts that we have. There were more, but they got lost in India in difficult times. So I'm enthusiastic because I personally find the discourses of the Pali Canon inspiring. They touch me directly, even though they're old. They've been passed down first orally and then in writing for so many years. They still seem to carry a spiritual charge, which makes sense really, because the early Buddhists, as we might imagine, were very determined to try and remember what their teacher, the Buddha, taught. This doesn't mean, however, we need to relate to these ancient discourses as being somehow historically the word of the Buddha. In a way, that's really unlikely to be the case, because some people aren't tape recorders. Rather, they remember the spirit of what they heard. And as we'll see, these discourses are preserved in a formulaic, repetitive way that is easy to remember. And that's the reason they sound like they do, rather than the Buddha being a really boring person or something. Which I don't think is the case. So rather than giving you some sort of overview of the Pali Canon, which would be descriptive and perhaps in interest to some of you, instead, in 4 weeks, each week I have introduced, and I'm going to introduce tonight and next week, a particular discourse, a particular short discourse, the kind of thing we can get to grips with in an hour's talk. And this evening we have the Discourse on the Not-Self Characteristic. That's such a sexy title, isn't it? The Discourse on the Not-Self Characteristic. So once again, you've got some copies kindly made by Pañcavaggiya, who asks me to remind you that translations of the Pali Canon are available in the bookshop, apparently at reduced prices. I think it's no accident. Do you get that feeling sometimes? It's not buy one, get one free, I don't think, but something like that. Last week we looked at a discourse called Turning the Wheel of the Dharma, and it's regarded traditionally as the Buddha's very first sermon, his first teaching to his former companions, the group of 5 ascetics. So this evening, as I promised last week, we have the second sermon, the Buddha's second sermon to these same 5 ascetics. The discourse on the not-self characteristic goes by another title in Sri Lanka, and that's the Discourse to the Group of 5. And this alternative title gives us a better idea, really, of what's going on. The Buddha's in conversation with these former 5 companions, a kind of lively spiritual interchange. At the end of the first sermon, if you were here, you might remember that Pañcavaggiya had the insight that whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. And this insight was a breakthrough for him. Whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. It's kind of obvious, but getting it is the point, really noticing that, wow, what I suppose is lasting actually is of a nature to cease. But I'd suggest it was also a breakthrough for the Buddha to discover that for the first time he was able to communicate something of the Dharma to somebody else, at least to Pañcavaggiya, at least enough to induce this kind of insight that Pañcavaggiya had, which traditionally is regarded as leading to stream entry. That's to say, entering the stream of experience that leads on to nirvana and the end of dukkha. So in this second sermon, so you've got Pañcavaggiya, who's stream entry, and the other four disciples who we take it for granted that they also got a good sense of what the Buddha was on about in the first sermon. It's not that they're said to have got it, but they must have got something. Because in the second sermon, the Buddha goes on to address them all together, and he gives them a very direct and specific teaching on what I've translated, the not self characteristic. And we'll see that this teaching leads all of them on to see through any confusion they might have about who they really are and move them on and into a liberating knowledge of how things actually are. So that's what we're going to read. I've given you that summary just because, as you'll see, the discourse, like many discourses, is somewhat formulaic. It's interesting giving talks like this. One realises that what I'm so used to and what appears to me is very, very attractive in a certain way, I've got sort of steeped in over quite a few years, and I don't know how it comes across to anybody else in some ways. So I'll read it through. And by the way, if any questions crop up at any time, where's Taraniti gone? Then just call them out. Just call them out. I've got plenty to say, but it's quite important, I think, that if I've just forgotten to say something, or that you think, well, that doesn't make sense, or what did the Buddha mean there, or what does he mean there? Just ask. That's important, I think, with this kind of talk. So, the discourse on the not self characteristic. On one occasion, the Buddha was living near Varanasi at Isipatana in the deer park. There the Blessed One addressed the group of 5 monks. "Monks," he said. "Sir," those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said, "Physical form, monks, is not the self. For if physical form were the self, then it would not be disposed to affliction, getting ill, and so on. And with regard to physical form, it would be possible to say, may my physical form be like this, may my physical form not be like that. But, monks, because physical form is not the self, then physical form is disposed to affliction, and it is not possible to say, with regard to physical form, may my physical form be like this, may my physical form not be like that. Feeling tone, monks, is not the self. ... He repeats exactly that same formula in regard to feeling tone. Perception and cognition, monks, is not the self. Habitual tendencies, monks, are not the self. Finally, consciousness, monks, is not the self. If consciousness were the self, then it would not be disposed to affliction, and with regard to consciousness, it would be possible to say, may my consciousness be like this, may my consciousness not be like that. But, monks, because consciousness is not the self, then consciousness is disposed to affliction, and it is not possible to say, with regard to consciousness, may my consciousness be like this, may my consciousness not be like that. What do you think, monks? Is physical form permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. And what is impermanent? Is that unsatisfactory or pleasing? Unsatisfactory, Lord. And what is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change? Is it appropriate to regard it thus? This is mine. I am this. This is myself. Certainly not, Lord. Is feeling tone permanent or impermanent? Is perception and cognition permanent or impermanent? Are habitual tendencies permanent or impermanent? Is consciousness permanent or impermanent? Impermanent, Lord. And what is impermanent? Is that unsatisfactory or pleasing? Unsatisfactory, Lord. And what is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change? Is it appropriate to regard it thus? This is mine. I am this. This is myself. Certainly not, Lord. Therefore, monks, whatever physical form there is, past, future, or presently arisen, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or excellent, far away or nearby, all that physical form should be seen with right insight as it really is in this way. This is not myself. I am not this. This is not myself. It's not quite, it should be, this is mine, I am this. This is not mine, I am not this. This is not myself. I don't have a proofreader. There you go, that's the problem there. And again, the Buddha goes on, whatever feeling there is, ... same formula, whatever perception and cognition there is, whatever habitual tendencies there are, and finally, whatever consciousness there is, past, future, or presently arisen, internal or external, coarse or subtle, inferior or excellent, far away or nearby, all that consciousness should be seen with right understanding as it actually is in this way. This is not mine, I am not this, this is not myself. Monks, an informed noble disciple, seeing in this way, becomes disenchanted with physical form, becomes disenchanted with feeling tone, becomes disenchanted with perception and cognition, becomes disenchanted with habitual tendencies, becomes disenchanted with consciousness. Disenchanted, one becomes self-possessed. Through self-possession, one is liberated. When one is liberated, there is the knowledge that one is liberated. One directly knows that birth is destroyed, the spiritual life has been lived, what was to be done has been done, and there is nothing further than this state. When the Blessed One has spoken, the group of 5 monks were delighted, and they rejoiced at the teaching of the Blessed One. And while this explanation was being made, the hearts and minds of the group of 5 monks were liberated from the pollutants by not holding on. And that last phrase, liberated from the pollutants by not holding on, it's another way in which these early Buddhist texts regularly describe awakening, attaining nirvana. So, as I gave away last week in a spoiler, at the end of this discourse, the 5 monks become awakened. In fact, they become, therefore, the first 5 arahants taught by the Buddha. And now there's a sangha of the Buddha plus his 5 awakened disciples.
Can I ask a question?
Yay!
The Buddha says, if physical form were the self, then it would not be disposed to affliction. Why is that?
So,
what's he getting at?
What's he getting at? Yeah. Well, you could imagine that that's what my talk's going to be about. But I think I'll fill it in now anyway, because, of course, what occurs to me is to be said might be different from what Taranita's got in mind. So I'm going to be... I'll answer this now, and I'll probably repeat it a bit later as well, but that's no problem, is it? So this word self is a translation of a Pali word atta, or a translation of the Sanskrit word atman. And the connotation of this word atman is a fixed, permanent essence of who you are. So at the time of the Buddha, in the spiritual culture of ancient India, it was widely assumed that the point of engaging with the spiritual life was to discover some real and lasting essence of who you are, a spiritual essence, you could say. It's usually identified with consciousness. The Atman is consciousness, truth, and bliss. That is an Upanishadic type of summary. So the assumption would be that if you find the Atman, this Atman will be happy. It won't be prone to affliction. It won't get ill. It won't suffer. If you find this Atman, this self, you'll find what is lastingly blissful in life. So when the Buddha says physical form is not the self, for if physical form were the self, then it would not be disposed to affliction. He's drawing out a fairly logical line of thinking for ancient Indian thinkers, that if the body were the self, it would be the kind of thing that would be permanently happy. But is it like that? And of course, it's hardly anyone has had no experience at all of bodily affliction. So it simply follows that the body is not the self, which in any case is not much of a surprise. Does that answer your question, Taranita?
Yes. So am I right in thinking that this self that he's talking about would be an essence of what one is, and it would therefore be ongoing, reborn, or reincarnated, depending upon your religious persuasion, and would therefore be unchanging, and would therefore be unafflicted in that.
Totally unafflicted, that's right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So the body can't be in.
Strictly speaking, from the point of view of ancient Indian cosmology, rebirth is just painful. It involves birth, it involves aging, sickness and death. And it just keeps going while the conditions are still present. This was the belief structure of the time. And that happens simply because we haven't discovered the Atman. If that makes sense. Once one discovers the Atman, that puts an end to future rebirth.
So in that traditional way of looking at things, that self that's being reborn and again and again, that remains a kernel that's unaffected, because I guess you're gradually moving, you're gaining spiritual experience, and you're gradually moving towards enlightenment kind of thing in a traditional way, but that self presumably isn't doing that because that's unchanging, is it? Or?
That's right. The self, the Atman, in this Upanishadic view, is not reborn. It remains the same. Yeah. It's a kind of hidden essence.
But isn't that giving quite a notion of something that's quite fixed and
completely fixed. Yeah.
Completely fixed.
Yeah.
So what is it that's attaining nirvana or whatever in that sense?
For Buddhism now, rather than go on to that, should we work through the discourse? Because I think it gets clearer what the Buddha's getting at as we work through it. The way I've put it, it sounds quite difficult to understand, doesn't it? But I've characterised the context, the spiritual context in which the Buddha was working, a belief that attaining the Atman would give us, attaining a lasting spiritual essence is the answer.
But that wasn't the Buddha's view.
No, he's going to deny that completely. Pardon? yeah, it is. That's right. What I was saying sounds quite attractive in a certain way, doesn't it? But the Buddha. Right. So I'll launch into my talk. I'm giving it. I was answering a question, maybe slightly out of order, but hopefully it will get a bit clearer. So last week I made this possibly unfortunate comparison of the Buddha's first sermon with the ABBA song Waterloo.
I was hoping you weren't going to drop that into my meditation for the next 2 days this week.
Too late. So this song, it announced a sudden brilliant appearance of a soon-to-be world-famous talent. That was the point of the comparison. But it doesn't stop the tune getting into Dhivan Malini's head. And my point was that the four noble or ennobling truths, as I put them, they're a universe-wide hit. That was the point of this first sermon. It's a piece of early Buddhist rhetoric, you could say, advertising the appearance of the Buddhist teaching, the four noble or ennobling truths. And they're like a very memorable tune. That's the point. That will get the Dharma into everybody's heads. By contrast, in this second sermon, what we have is something different. The Buddha might be said to abandon jumpsuit and boots and put on the dark clothes and the hat of Leonard Cohen and sing something that goes straight into the heart. That's the point. It's a very different style we've got here. More difficult to understand, less memorable than Waterloo.
Like what song though? What song?
You could talk and then we could think of suggestions.
That's it, yeah. Over to you. Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, it is really, yeah. So this really might not be obvious from the bare words of the discourse. We've heard this discourse and it's not that easy to understand, is it? I think that's perhaps not just a few people's experience. This particular discourse is a little bit a bit challenging. So not only is it replete with repetition, but there's a somewhat forbidding technical vocabulary, and we've heard about it. It assumes you understand what's going on in the background of Indian spiritual culture. So, but let's once again think about this discourse as literature, as not so much as a historical record, but as literature. It's almost absurd, actually, to suppose that this discourse represents in a literally historical way the words of the Buddha to his first 5 disciples, because the Buddha would have been right at the beginning of his teaching career, and he was yet to develop the ideas and methods that are so richly preserved in the early Buddhist texts. It makes more sense, I think, to suppose that this discourse represents a way of putting the Dharma that the early Buddhists considered to be especially characteristic or typical of their teacher. So by imagining the Buddha as putting the Dharma into this way to his very first disciples, the Buddhists who composed this early discourse were doing justice to the memory of the Buddha. That's my idea. So in that sense, they managed to put into this discourse a kind of condensed version of one way in which the Buddha taught. So this is a condensed account of what must have been familiar to the early Buddhists, is how the Buddha taught his Dharma. The Buddha, he's very consistent in saying the Dharma is not easy to understand. If it was easy to understand, you would have got it. Yeah. So if you find this discourse difficult or challenging or confusing, it's because the Dharma is not easy to understand. And yet it is possible, or else these 5 disciples wouldn't have been able to understand it. But they do by the end of the discourse. So that's a bit of scene setting for why it might be difficult. So in this discourse, there's hardly any scene setting. In fact, the Buddha just addresses the group of 5 monks while they're living together in the deer park at modern-day Sarnath near Varanasi. But rather than telling them something, which he'd done in the first sermon, where he told them about the middle way and the 4 ennobling truths, not the 5, the 4 ennobling truths. He just told them that. He gave them the good news, so to speak. He sang them the song. In this discourse, he asked them questions, or it's an invitation for them to ask themselves questions, to investigate. He's not telling them what to think. He's inviting them to consider what's going on in their experience. So this is much more reminiscent of the Buddha's teaching strategy when he was talking to the Kalamas. If you were here 2 weeks ago, you might remember that in that discourse, the Kalama Sutta, the people called the Kalamas, they'd had enough of being told by various religious teachers what to think, what the truth was. And those religious teachers also adding that whoever says anything different is an idiot and is wrong. The Buddha had advised the Kalamas of a method by which they could decide for themselves what should count as a wholesome mental state and the advantages of it. He didn't tell them what to think. But here he's talking to these 5 former companions, but they're different kind of person to the Kalamas. They're experienced spiritual strivers. They've all been on the path for a long time, doing their asceticism, fasting, and sitting in meditation for long periods. They're intent upon liberation. So the Buddha assumes a sort of shared context of effort and understanding, and perhaps meditation practice. So there's a kind of framework of commitment which is assumed in the conversation that the Buddha's about to have. So then he asked the monks these various leading questions, and they're designed to get them to question their assumptions and to rethink their views. That's the idea. So now we get into what they were perhaps assuming and what the Buddha is trying to get them to think about. Actually, any of you I don't know if any of you have read Plato, but you might recognise this style of questioning. It reminds us of Socrates a bit, who claimed he knew nothing except for the fact that he knew nothing. He did know that. And then he cross-questioned. Plato has Socrates cross-questioning his interlocutors until it becomes very apparent that they don't know anything either. And you get the sense from these Platonic, these Socratic dialogues that the people Socrates is talking to have their assumptions just pulled out from underneath them, and that sort of creates space, as it were, for them to think through things in a new way. So I've got a really bad example here. So this is true, actually. I'd always thought that Leonard Cohen was just one of these hippie kind of crooners that had smoked too much cannabis and didn't make any sense. And then one time, Mitra Devi played me his greatest hits while we were travelling in the car. And I had this kind of revelation that this is some of the best songs that have ever been written. They're so touchingly beautiful. And I realised I'd know nothing. I'd know nothing about Leonard Cohen. But in a more sort of relevant way, maybe we've each had the experience in meditation that our usual way of looking at things kind of suddenly cracks and falls apart. It's as if you're looking at an image in the mirror and it just cracks and you can't see that image anymore. Maybe our breath, we might discover, actually isn't boring at all. It's an incredibly interesting living experience, and that could be a real surprise to us. Or maybe that, even more profoundly, we can discover that we can notice with a shock that we don't have any obligation to hold on to our resentments. Those, the various things we tend to think we don't have any choice about. Oh, I keep on holding them. And this can be like our assumptions getting suddenly completely pulled out from underneath us. So I'd say that although there's this comparison with the sort of Socratic method, the Buddha seems to be rather different from Socrates. He always, it's as though the Buddha did actually claim to definitely know something about awakening. But the problem is that awakening isn't an idea and it can't be put into words. So the Buddha can't just tell people what awakening is. He somehow has to get them to discover it for themselves. And so each of us, in fact, in the same way, have to discover it for themselves. I could stand here telling you over and again what the Buddha said, but it wouldn't necessarily communicate the Dharma. So he's engaging his monks here in this process of what we might call destructive cross-questioning, getting them to really look at their assumptions. So this method depends on a way of dividing up our experience of ourselves into 5 constituents. The word is khandhas in Pali, and that's often translated aggregates, or even heaps. I don't know if you've come across this. Do we still say heaps in the Heart Sutra?
No.
We don't anymore. But it's definitely sort of part of our Triratana discourse. You might hear of 5 heaps or skandhas. I prefer the translation constituents. It's a bit more pedestrian in a way, but it perhaps gets at what the word means a bit more. There's 5 constituents of experience. So the Buddha just makes this, he uses this structure as a sort of working way of getting people to think. So firstly, there's physical form. That's to say our bodies, the physical stuff we're made of, but also the attributes of our body, our bodies, its abilities and its characteristics, how it moves and so on. This is all physical form. Then there's feeling tone. Vedana. This means the way we feel in terms of experience, whether pleasant or painful. Almost all the time, in our bodies, in our experience of sensing the world, there's various responses of pleasant and painful to what's happening, and this is the constituent of feeling tone. Then there's perception and cognition. Like, for instance, right now, you're perceiving me standing, giving this talk, you're perceiving words, you're having thoughts perhaps, either about the talk or about something completely different. Your experience consists of perceptions and cognitions. And then there's habitual tendencies, a more dynamic sort of constituent of our experience. All the time there's familiar patterns and dispositions going on in what's happening in our experience. Sometimes we like these patterns, sometimes we hate them. They're part of what, in a way, they're kind of familiar aspects of what makes our experience recognisable to us. And finally, there's consciousness, which is to say the awareness of ourselves as being a body, as having feelings, of cognitions and perceptions, being prone to habit, and also aware of being aware. You can quite easily notice right now that you're aware. Our consciousness is like that. It's reflexive most of the time.
So can I just ask, so is it really self-consciousness? Because I would think of perceptions as being one element of consciousness, but this last, is it Vijnana, seems to be more about self-consciousness.
Yeah, so you're raising the question, Tim, of whether what we mean by perception and cognition isn't part of consciousness, and what we mean by consciousness or vijnana is a self-consciousness. Yes, I think most prominently what we mean by consciousness is the reflexive awareness of what's going on. Yeah, we could say the self-consciousness, although it'll turn out that what this word self means is up for questioning here.
Where does, I was just sort of thinking about sense data, where does that fit in to all these 5 categories? Because it sort of underlies them all, really, doesn't it?
Sure.
Even Rupa, you're feeling yourself, that's based on sense data, isn't it?
That's right, although usually perception and cognition would be perception of what is seen, heard, smelt, tasted, touched.
Right.
So perception would incorporate sense data.
Yeah, I suppose that nothing comes first, so all these 5 are interrelated.
You've got it. These are 5 constituents of experience.
Yeah.
One doesn't come before the other. They're all 5 are necessary for us to be here having experience.
What about cats?
Pardon? What about cats?
Are cats subject to? Do cats consist of 5 heaps?
Yep.
Right. Okay.
So cat experience consists of physical form, cat body, feeling tone. Probably mammals have feeling. All mammals probably have feeling tones, just like humans, because it depends on a particular nervous system.
Might be more smell orientated, but yeah, similar.
Cat perceptions and cognitions will be a bit different. I mean, dogs have got that massive nose cognition, haven't they? Cats, what more? Eye cognition. Yeah. Habitual tendencies. I mean, cats are a bundle of habits, aren't they? Yeah. And consciousness. Cats are certainly conscious. Apparently, they're not self-conscious in the way that some primates, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, elephants are able to recognise themselves in mirrors.
Sorry, how do you know that?
About cats.
About no, how do you know about which animals are?
There's a test they can do.
Yeah, you sedate the animal. You put a coloured patch on its forehead. Yeah, wake it up again.
Yes.
And then because we can't talk to animals, we have to find indirect methods of finding out what they are conscious of. And then if they look in the mirror and start, trying to work out what this coloured patch is, you know that they can recognise themselves in the mirror. Cats don't recognise themselves in mirrors, according to them.
I think we want that reference, actually.
Are there any cat consciousnessists here? Is that the point?
Ashoka's self-conscious, self-aware.
Well, this is Taranita's cat called Ashoka.
It sounds like that mirror thing is a bit biased towards the visual, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Totally.
That's what mirror is, it's visual. Yeah.
I think one conclusion from those kinds of tests is that consciousness is a sort of continuum. Yeah. So you could say that at the other end, an earthworm, it's got the most limited kind of consciousness. Yeah. I mean, you can stick it in front of a mirror, but it hasn't even got eyes, has it? Other end, cats and humans are going to be not so different. Well, humans have just got a lot of self-consciousness. Whose question was that? Was that Taranita's cat question? But yeah, the account of the 5 constituents, I think actually can be applied to all sentient beings.
Yeah.
Which is quite important, actually, I think.
Yeah.
The Buddha was never a sort of speciesist in the way that Western philosophy can assume. It doesn't work for trees, though, because they don't have nervous systems.
But the Buddha didn't like cats.
Don't say that in
I
front
beg
of
your
Karen.
pardon.
I think that's a myth.
Because a cat is one of the few animals that exhibits high levels of cruelty. They play with their prey rather than just...
Apart from people.
That's only because they're domesticated.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks. But following on from that, we could ask ourselves, is there, for cats or humans, is there anything else in experience? Is experience made of anything else beside these 5 constituents? Then it might be this might be a brand new kind of way of thinking about experience to you, because it's specifically Buddhist. I know for me, I'm more comfortable with dividing experience into body, thinking, which goes on in the head region, feeling, which is more in the body, in the heart region, and then willing, which seems to happen more or less everywhere. So that would be like sort of my native way of thinking about what is my experience made of. Does that make sense? So you might have some way of thinking about what is experience. And that would do just as well, actually, as these 5 constituents. It's not Buddhist dogma, as it were. It's simply a way of dividing up experience.
What do you mean by willing?
Willing means engaging the intention to act. So I need to will to speak in order to speak. I'm not a machine who just talks, as it were. Willing is quite complicated, actually. So, going back to our discourse now, the Buddha gets the monks to consider whether any of these constituents is the self. So, the self, Atman, this is where I said we'd cover the same ground, means who you really are. So I'm actually using a slightly broader characterisation now. I said earlier that in the Buddhist context, the self would be this permanent spiritual essence. But I think we can take what the Buddha is talking about to be, in a broader sense, who you really are. Or rather, who you think you really are. And he presents 2 arguments for the monks to chew on. First, he gets them to consider how they're not able to control body or feeling tone or perception or cognition or habitual tendencies or consciousness. Is it true? If you're anything like me, I feel I can control them a bit. Yeah? I can move my arm. I've started doing pull-ups again recently, and you feel a bit fitter for it until you hurt your elbows, Taranita and I have discovered. We don't have much control, and certainly not when it counts. That's the problem, I think. For instance, if you catch a virus, you don't have control over the body. Experience mostly just happens, and we find ourselves carried along, hoping for the best.
We can influence it, can't we? But we can't really put our hand in a flame and say that's not going to hurt, or it's not going to burn me.
Just by saying it's not going to burn.
Yeah, I'm not going to let it burn me. No, we can't control that. We can choose not to put our hand in the flame.
Very sensibly, yeah. So the Buddha isn't suggesting that that there's a problem. He's just pointing out that we we have to be careful. We just practice. We're just naturally careful because we can't control feeling tone of the body's fragility and so on. But perhaps that's not a surprise with the body or feeling tone or perception. So, who are we really? I think the most likely candidate, if you think anything like me, is that who we are really is consciousness, self-consciousness. So I'd say that who I really am, who I really think I am, this is going to get undermined, just to give it away, is a deep awareness of being the same person over many years. But then you think, am I exactly the same person? But sometimes it feels that way. My body changes, feeling tones come and go, perceptions and cognitions change all the time. Habitual tendencies, they tend to have a life of their own. But consciousness is pretty steadily me. But then can I control my consciousness? It doesn't really work like that, does it? If I'm busy or if life is going badly, even self-consciousness becomes, we get afflicted by emotion, essentially, without our being able to control it particularly. And maybe I can think, I'll find my real self if I get on retreat. That might work. But of course, that isn't always our experience either. So the Buddha then gets the monks to consider whether the constituents, these same constituents of experience, are permanent or impermanent. It's a kind of leading question, isn't it? And the monks do give him the answer which he was expecting, I think, that the constituents are impermanent. They're changing. But then he gets them to take the next step and ask whether, if they're impermanent, can they be really satisfying? And that's quite a question, isn't it? Can we expect satisfaction from any of these constituents of experience? And of course there's some satisfaction to be got from bodies and from feeling tones and from perceptions and cognitions and from consciousness. But the Buddha's not telling the monks what to think. He's inviting them to consider whether it's really okay, whether they're really satisfied with the idea that there's only some satisfaction to be got in experience. When in fact they're probably hoping that who they really are is going to be satisfactory, going to be really satisfied. So finally, the Buddha asks the monks whether it's appropriate to say of any changing and partially satisfactory set of constituents that this is mine, I am this is myself. Would you be prepared to say of your body or your feeling tones or perceptions and cognitions or habitual tendencies or even your self-consciousness that this is mine, I am this is myself? And what would happen if you did? I think that's more to the point. Say if you were to say of your body, this is mine, I am this is myself. And then you get ill, or it lets you down. There's going to be a sense of confusion that actually I was wrong. This isn't who I really am. I'm hoping to get across the kind of difficulty of this sort of investigation. It cuts quite deeply into our normal assumptions, our working assumptions, that perhaps we're not even very aware of about what we identify with. So the monks aren't really being invited by the Buddha to give the right answer to these questions, just because they're good Buddhists, because that wouldn't do the trick. Rather, they're rehearsing a set of considerations about what it means to be a human being. So for myself, when I ask about consciousness, is it really who I am? It becomes clear to me, at least, that what appears to be myself in self-consciousness is really just a constant welling up of awareness. I like this image of welling up. Awareness just keeps on welling up, and I keep on thinking, this is me. It just keeps on appearing that way. So I continually identify with awareness as if I hoped it was me, as it were, continuously. As if I continually kept saying to myself, this is who I am. But that isn't actually the same as myself, is it? It's simply the appearance of a self. And that's all it is.
Appearing in the form of thoughts.
What's that, sorry?
Appearing in the form of thoughts.
Yeah, well, a bit more strongly than a thought even, perhaps. It's more like identification is quite an emotional experience, I think. But we can put it into words to ourselves sometimes, can't we?
Is it something like a movie film strip, that when you watch a film you see a continuous motion and action going on, but if you slow it right down to individual frames or animation cells or things like that, that's one thing, and then there's the next thing, and then there's the next thing. They're all sort of separate in a way, but you see them as a continuous sort of
separate, but the ones next to each other are similar.
Yeah,
so
they're just
together.
slightly different.
Yeah, that's a nice metaphor for the kind of thing that the Buddha's getting at. And I think if you get very close to the screen, also the image comes apart, doesn't it, into pixels. It depends on.
There was another thought experiment that someone called Derek Parfit did when he was very into sort of this idea of selves, and he said if you in some future world had teleportation and you could teleport yourself around the solar system or something, and what if that process goes wrong, and instead of dismantling you in this place and reassembling you exactly the same in the other place, what if it assembles you in the other place but the other person is still there, and this person who's been teleported is exactly the same as the one who's still there, and all his constituents and his feelings and his thoughts about his history and so on, then who is the self then? Is the self the one that was left behind, but he's exactly the same as the one who's on Mars, kind of thing. You could do that an infinite number of times effectively, and so I guess the point he's making is that there is nothing really that's apart from those experiences and those sensations and feelings that makes up the person. That original person's doing different from all the others.
Yeah, so Derek Parfit, a modern contemporary philosopher, he's not influenced by Buddhism, but he's exploring very similar territory. And Parfit's a good person to talk about because he doesn't deny that there is continuity in our experience. Nobody would deny that there's some sort of continuity in my experience from yesterday or 10 years ago and now. The question is whether I'm really the same person. That's the question that the Buddha's asking the monks about. So I'm going to try and wrap this up. We're sort of in such a massive exploration. It's a difficult one to quite wrap up. So, following the discourse, if in fact one can't find within experience anything of which one can truly say, this is myself, this is what or who I really am, then actually it turns out you're free to let go of any idea that your experience should be a certain way. And you're free to let go of all the emotional reactions that go with having such a view of my experience should go a certain way. So the Buddha describes this process as having 3 stages. He says, seeing in this way, one becomes disenchanted with the constituents of experience. So there's disenchantment. And disenchantment means a spell being broken, as it were. It's a bit like, a child at a certain point just stops being interested in certain toys and doesn't go back to them. You grow out of things. So one becomes disenchanted with constituents of experience, thinking they're really who you are. Then there's a stage of becoming self-possessed. This word viraga is usually translated dispassion. One becomes dispassionate, but that kind of suggests in English that you're kind of cut off from what you feel, I think, or it can do, dispassionate. So perhaps composed or self-possessed, at ease in what is happening in your experience, not liable to be taken in at all by the various pushes and pulls of your emotions. And then finally, there's the stage of liberation, which means no longer at the beck and call of views and emotions, free from them. So those stages, disenchantment, self-possession, liberation, they follow from deeply investigating the constituents of experience. So the group of 5 monks get it. That's what it says at the end, isn't it? When the Blessed One has spoken, the 5 monks were delighted and they rejoiced at the teaching of the Blessed One. So they must have got it each in their own way through an individual process of consideration, inquiry. It's not obvious in this discourse, but we're filling in the background now. So they too have gained awakening and the end of dukkha. So this second sermon gives us not a historical record, but a kind of paradigm example, that's how I'm thinking of it, of how the Buddha taught and how the insight process might unfold for people. Now, it's just an example, I think that's really important, of a method, of one method. And the Buddha taught very many methods and ways that this process might unfold. Not all of them as kind of philosophical or as cognitive as this. And those methods depend on who he's talking to. But this particular discourse tells it in a really condensed form. This is how it was, at least for these 5 monks. And so anyway, the Buddha tells it like it is. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.